3 encounters from the Cold War and beyond. Settle in. Pull the blanket a little closer. Let the darkness outside your window become something you're sharing with hundreds of thousands of other listeners right now. Find a comfortable position. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we're diving into 3 encounters drawn directly from declassified United States government documents. UAP reports that were once stamped classified and locked in filing cabinets inside embassies, intelligence agencies, and military installations around the world. Reports that sat in the dark for years before daylight finally reached them. These aren't rumors. These aren't stories someone told at a bar after one too many drinks. These aren't the fevered imaginings of lonely people looking for attention. These are official reports filed by intelligence officers, embassy staff, military pilots, and government officials. People who had every reason to keep quiet and no reason to make things up. People whose careers would have been destroyed by false testimony. People who filed the reports anyway, because what they witnessed demanded to be recorded. Our journey tonight takes us from the dense, sweltering jungles of Papua New Guinea to the frozen, empty steppes of Kazakhstan, and finally into the heart of a top-secret Soviet weapons facility where something appeared in the sky that no one could explain, and no one could explain away. These 3 stories span 2 decades, 3 continents, and vastly different contexts. From frightened villagers to veteran airline pilots to Cold War intelligence operatives. But they share one thread. In each case, credible witnesses reported something in the sky that the authorities could not identify, could not debunk, and ultimately could not explain. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what you're about to hear might keep you up a little longer than you planned. Let's begin. Imagine Papua New Guinea in January of 1985. A nation of dense rainforests and impossibly remote highland villages scattered across one of the most rugged landscapes on Earth. A country where hundreds of distinct languages are spoken, where communities exist in valleys so deep and mountains so steep that some villages had no contact with the outside world until the middle of the 20th century. Outside the cities, the darkness at night is absolute. No light pollution, no city glow, no hum of electricity. Just the jungle canopy above you and the vast Pacific sky beyond it, thick with stars. Now imagine you're a resident of Wewak, a coastal town on the northern shore of the mainland. It's late January, the height of the wet season. The humidity hangs in the air like a warm, damp cloth. The palm fronds drip. The insects sing their nightly chorus. And then, from somewhere impossibly high above, you hear it. A sound like thunder, but not thunder. Steady, moving, fast. Something is crossing the sky above you, something that should not be there. Between January 24th and January 28th, 1985, something extraordinary happened in the skies over Papua New Guinea. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 people who noticed. It wasn't a handful of confused villagers pointing at the sky. It was entire communities. It was multiple towns across a wide geographical area. The fear became so widespread, so palpable, so deeply unsettling, that the events reached the desk of the National Intelligence Organization of Papua New Guinea, who then formally reported the matter to the United States Embassy in Port Moresby, the capital. And the U.S. Embassy documented every word. The reports began filtering in from the Wewak area and the surrounding provinces. Residents were frightened, genuinely deeply frightened. These were people who lived close to the land, who knew the rhythms of their sky, who could identify birds and weather patterns and the distant rumble of distant storms. And they described overflights by aircraft that were operating at what they could tell was extreme altitude and extreme speed. These were not commercial flights. There were no scheduled routes over that part of the country at those hours. These were not small planes buzzing the coast. Something was moving through the skies above them, fast, high, and in formation. Something that made a sound they had never heard before. Something that shook the air. The situation became serious enough that the provincial premier took action. He called a public meeting to address the fears of his constituents, and this wasn't some small town council session in a back room with a few dozen attendees. The Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea attended. Let that sink in for a moment. The head of state, the leader of an entire nation, showed up at a provincial town meeting because ordinary civilians were scared of what was flying over them at night. Think about the level of alarm required for that to happen. Think about the number of reports, the consistency of the testimony, the sheer weight of credible witnesses needed to bring a prime minister to a coastal town to discuss what was happening in the sky above his people. And the citizens weren't the only ones reporting these objects. An Air New Guinea pilot, a commercial airline pilot flying one of the national carrier's routes across the northern part of the country, picked up something on his radar over the town of Angaram. His instruments detected aircraft flying at high altitude and high speed on a south to north trajectory. These were not ghosts on the screen. These were not glitches or malfunctions. These were hard returns, tracked and confirmed by professional aviation equipment operated by a trained crew who understood exactly what their instruments were telling them. Visual sightings corroborated the radar data. Observers at various points around Papua New Guinea, people in different towns, in different provinces, with no way to communicate with each other in real time, reported seeing contrails. The condensation trails left by high-altitude aircraft, cutting white lines across the tropical sky. The pattern was consistent and deeply strange. One aircraft moving north to south was observed at approximately 7 in the evening local time. A single craft crossing the sky alone. Then, at 10 o'clock, 3 hours later, between 6 and 8 aircraft were seen traveling in formation south to north. A squadron, moving together at speed through the darkness above the jungle. 6 to 8 aircraft, in formation, over one of the most remote and isolated nations on the planet. A country with no significant military aviation of its own. A country whose airspace was, for all practical purposes, completely undefended. So what were they? The United States Embassy in Port Moresby did exactly what you'd expect a responsible diplomatic mission to do. They checked. They contacted the appropriate military and intelligence channels back in Washington. They asked the direct question. Did the United States have any aircraft operating in Papua New Guinean airspace during that period? Any authorized flights? Any reconnaissance missions? Any exercises? And the answer came back. No B-52 overflights had been authorized. No United States military aircraft were operating in Papua New Guinean airspace during that period. No U.S. assets were in the region. And that, in many ways, is the most unsettling part of this entire episode. Because if it wasn't the Americans, and the Americans had no reason to lie to their own embassy staff in an official communication, then who was flying formation over Papua New Guinea? The Soviet Union was one theoretical possibility, though projecting military aircraft that far into the Pacific over a sovereign nation with which Moscow had no particular grievance would have been an extraordinary provocation with no clear strategic purpose. No other nation at the time had the demonstrated capability to operate high-altitude, high-speed aircraft in those numbers at that distance in that part of the world. And certainly no nation would have done so openly enough to be seen by civilians, tracked by commercial radar, and witnessed across multiple provinces. The mystery was never solved. The file was closed. The embassy report was classified, filed away, and eventually released under disclosure rules years later. a thin sheaf of pages documenting a 4-day event that terrified a nation and baffled an intelligence community. But somewhere in the archives of the United States government, the testimony of frightened villagers, a provincial premier, a prime minister, a commercial airline pilot, and a national intelligence agency sits under the quiet weight of an answer that was never found. And the skies above Papua New Guinea were never quite the same again. Now let's fast forward 9 years and half a world away. January 27, 1994. The Cold War is technically over. The Soviet Union has dissolved into 15 independent republics. The old boundaries are blurring. The maps are being redrawn. And into this new uncertain world flies a Boeing 747 SP, a special performance variant of the iconic jumbo jet, one of the most recognizable aircraft ever built, operated by Tajik Air on a route across the vast, frozen emptiness of Central Asia. At the controls is Chief Pilot Ed Rhodes. Rhodes is an American citizen, a veteran aviator, and a former Pan Am pilot, meaning he had spent some of his career with one of the great international airlines, flying long-haul routes across oceans and continents. He's spent decades in the cockpit. He's logged tens of thousands of hours in the air. He has watched more sunsets and sunrises from above the clouds than most people will ever see from the ground. Accompanying him on this flight are 2 American pilot colleagues, 3 sets of experienced eyes, 3 professional minds, 3 people who understand aircraft and atmosphere and the physics of flight as well as anyone alive. They are at 41,000 feet, above most commercial traffic, in the thin, cold air of the upper troposphere. Over Kazakhstan, roughly latitude 45 degrees north, longitude 55 degrees east. The land below is dark, flat, and frozen. There is nothing down there but steppe. No city lights, no highways, just the ancient grassland of Central Asia, sleeping under winter stars. It's the middle of the night. The cockpit instruments glow. The engines hum their steady song. And then something appears. From over the eastern horizon, approaching at what the crew could only describe as great speed, and at an altitude much higher than their own cruising altitude, a bright light materialized. It came from below the horizon line, which meant it was very, very far away, and it was moving toward them with a velocity that immediately commanded their full attention. This was not a dim flicker. This was not a star or a satellite making its predictable arc. This was not a meteor burning a brief trail through the atmosphere. This was a light of enormous intensity, blinding, pulsing, alive with energy in a way that 3 veteran pilots had never seen before. The crew watched in fascination and growing disbelief. For the next 40 minutes, not seconds, not a brief flash, but nearly an hour, the object performed maneuvers that by every law of physics and aviation they knew should have been impossible. It moved in circles. It corkscrewed through the sky in tight spirals. It executed 90-degree turns at rapid speed, the kind of instantaneous directional changes that would generate forces so extreme they would tear apart any known aircraft and kill any human pilot inside it. The G-forces involved in these maneuvers would have been catastrophic for any material we possess. No wing could survive it, no fuselage could withstand it, no human body could endure it. And this wasn't happening at low altitude, where you might confuse terrain features or ground reflections with aerial phenomena. This was happening far above them, at an altitude that would later be estimated at approximately 100,000 feet, nearly 19 miles up, twice the altitude of the highest flying conventional aircraft ever built. Way, way up, in the near vacuum of the stratosphere, where the sky turns from blue to indigo to black. Captain Rhodes did what any pilot would do. He reached for his pocket Olympus camera, a small, ordinary point-and-shoot that he happened to have with him, and took photographs. Through the cockpit windows of a Boeing 747 at 41,000 feet, pointing a consumer camera at something performing impossible maneuvers nearly 19 miles above the Earth. The object exhibited a phenomenon the crew described as a bow wave. If you've ever seen a high-speed photograph of a bullet in flight, the shock wave, visible as a cone of compressed air ahead of the projectile, the air itself being shoved aside by the sheer velocity of the object moving through it. That's what they saw. Something was moving so fast, so violently through the upper atmosphere, that it was creating a visible compression wave in front of it. A wake in the sky. And then came the sunrise. About 45 minutes after the object had finished its display and disappeared, dawn broke across the steppes of Kazakhstan. The eastern horizon turned gold, then orange, then the pale blue of a winter morning. And as the light filled the sky, the crew looked up, and they saw something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Contrails. At approximately 100,000 feet altitude, clearly visible against the brightening sky, were condensation trails, the frozen signatures of an object moving through air, or what passed for air at that impossible height. And these trails were not straight lines. They were not the neat parallel contrails of a jet aircraft following a flight path. They were curves, circles, and corkscrews, a ghostly, luminous record of every single maneuver the object had performed during those 40 minutes of darkness. The sky itself had kept a diary of what had happened, written in ice crystals 19 miles above the Earth. Now here's what makes this detail so significant, and I want you to really think about this. At 100,000 feet, the atmosphere is so thin, the air so sparse, that there is virtually no moisture available to form condensation trails. The trails left by conventional aircraft, even high-altitude reconnaissance planes like the U-2 or the legendary SR-71 Blackbird, form at much lower altitudes, where the air still contains enough water vapor to condense into visible ice crystals. These trails should not have been possible at that height, unless whatever was leaving them was operating at such extraordinary energy levels that it was creating its own atmosphere, or generating some kind of field that we don't understand, or operating on principles that don't appear in any physics textbook. The crew was adamant about one thing, and I want to be very clear about this because it speaks directly to their credibility and their professionalism. This was not a meteor. Captain Rhodes and his colleagues had spent years flying for Pan Am, one of the world's great international airlines, operating long-haul routes over the Atlantic, the Pacific, and every continent on Earth. In those years of long-haul night flying, at altitude, over oceans and deserts and frozen tundra, they had seen thousands of meteors, falling stars burning up in the atmosphere, streaking brief, bright lines across the darkness. They knew exactly what a meteor looked like. They knew the duration, the trajectory, the color, the behavior. They had seen thousands. This was not one of them. This was something else entirely. When asked for his professional assessment, his honest, considered, experienced opinion, Captain Rhodes did not hedge. He did not equivocate. He did not couch his words in the careful language of uncertainty. A man who had spent his adult life in the sky, who understood aircraft and atmospheres and physics and the difference between the explainable and the unexplainable, gave his opinion plainly. He believed what he witnessed was extraterrestrial in origin, and that it was under intelligent control. The photographs were taken. The report was filed. The incident was documented. The witness statements were recorded by people whose profession trained them to observe, report, and remain calm. And the contrails at 100,000 feet, Those impossible, beautiful spirals and corkscrews etched into the dawn sky like the fingerprints of something vast and unknown, dissolved into the morning light, leaving only the testimony of 3 American pilots over a country that had just emerged from behind the Iron Curtain, carrying with them a memory that no amount of time would diminish. Our final story tonight is drawn from a CIA intelligence report covering the period from November 1972 to November 1973. The source was a former Soviet citizen who provided information to American intelligence through a field report filed in Germany, one of the many human assets who risked their lives during the Cold War to pass information to the West. What this person described took place at one of the most secretive, most heavily guarded, most thoroughly classified locations in the entire Soviet Union. Sary Shagan. If you've never heard the name, Sary Shagan was the Soviet Union's primary weapons testing range for anti-ballistic missile systems. Located in the desolate, wind-swept steppe of central Kazakhstan, hundreds of miles from the nearest city of any size, it was where the USSR developed and tested the technologies meant to defend the motherland against a nuclear attack from the United States. It was a place of missile silos and radar arrays and underground bunkers. A place where the future of nuclear warfare was being invented. It was, in every sense, one of the most classified and heavily defended places on the planet. A place where even the people who worked there often didn't know what was happening in the buildings next door. And it was here, at a facility known as Site 7, that something unexplained appeared in the sky during the late summer of 1973. The source described the evening in mundane, almost domestic terms. The kind of casual, unremarkable detail that makes the testimony all the more credible, because real events don't begin with dramatic prologues. They begin with ordinary moments. He had been inside watching a sports competition, a hockey match, Canada versus the Soviet Union, on television. The kind of event that would have been national news in the USSR, a matter of civic pride. At some point during the broadcast, perhaps during an intermission or a lull in the action, he stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. It was a clear evening, no clouds. The Kazakh steppe stretched in every direction under a dome of stars, and when he looked up at the sky to the west, at an angle of roughly 70 degrees above the horizon, high up, almost directly overhead but tilted slightly, he saw something that stopped him cold. A sharp, bright green circular object, or perhaps a mass, hanging in the sky like an eye of emerald fire, burning with a light that was vivid and unnatural and utterly, completely wrong for the night sky. He could not determine its altitude. It could have been thousands of feet up, or it could have been in the upper atmosphere. There was no frame of reference, no way to judge distance. But the color was vivid and unmistakable, a sharp electric green, the kind of color you associate with chemical flares or phosphorescence, not with anything that belongs in the natural sky. Not a planet, not a star, not a weather phenomenon. Something with a color that nature doesn't produce at that altitude. And then, within 10 to 15 seconds, it began to change. The green circle widened, and as it expanded, it formed several green concentric circles around the central mass, rings within rings, radiating outward like ripples in a pond when a stone is dropped into still water. Except these ripples were made of light, and they pulsed with that same vivid, otherworldly green. The central mass remained, but around it bloomed these perfect geometric rings, expanding outward in symmetry, like the cross-section of an eye, like the pattern of a target, like something designed rather than something natural. The source watched in silence. There was no sound, no explosion, no shock wave, no rumble of engines or hiss of rocket fuel. just the silent, patient expansion of green light in the sky above one of the Soviet Union's most secret facilities. And then, within minutes, the coloring faded, the rings dissolved, the green light dimmed and vanished, consumed by the darkness it had briefly displaced. The sky returned to its normal state: stars, steppe, silence. And that was it. No debris, no impact, no evidence that anything had happened at all, except for the memory of a man standing alone under the Kazakh stars, watching something he could not explain, filing it away in his mind until the day he could tell someone who might listen. Now, let me tell you what makes this report particularly intriguing, what elevates it from a simple unidentified sighting to something that intelligence analysts considered worth including in a classified report to the American government. Sary Shagan was not just any weapons facility. It was the center of Soviet directed energy weapons research. In the 1970s and beyond, the Soviet Union poured enormous resources into laser technology, particle beam weapons, and other exotic systems designed to destroy incoming nuclear warheads before they could reach their targets. Some of the most advanced, most secret science in the world was being conducted in those facilities, behind those fences, in those underground laboratories. Some researchers have speculated over the years that what this source witnessed could have been a test of some kind of directed energy weapon, a powerful laser or particle beam fired into the upper atmosphere, causing ionization and luminescence in the air molecules it struck. The concentric circles could, in theory, be consistent with the diffraction patterns of a powerful energy beam interacting with the atmosphere, the light bending and spreading as it passed through layers of air with different densities. But this remains speculation. The CIA report does not offer an explanation. It does not theorize. It does not guess. It simply records the observation, filed by an intelligence officer who deemed the information worth including in a classified summary of unusual Soviet activities. The officer considered this noteworthy enough to include alongside reports of missile tests and weapons developments. Whatever the source saw, the CIA thought it mattered. What we're left with is this. On a clear summer evening in 1973, at the most advanced weapons testing facility in the Soviet Union, a man stepped outside to get some air during a hockey game and looked up to see rings of green light expanding silently across the sky above him, concentric circles of emerald fire growing outward in perfect geometry, then fading to nothing. And no one, not the CIA, not the Soviet scientists working at Sary Shagan, not the researchers who have studied this case since its declassification, has ever been able to say with certainty what it was. Sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that leave no wreckage. No wreckage, no debris, no impact crater. Just a man, a sky full of green rings, and a silence that has never been broken. 3 encounters, 3 sets of witnesses, 3 moments when the sky above ordinary people, villagers in Papua New Guinea, pilots over Kazakhstan, a man stepping outside a Soviet weapons facility, revealed something that defied easy explanation and resisted every attempt to explain it away. These aren't stories from the fringes. These aren't tales spun in dark corners of the internet. These are stories from the files of governments, documented by professionals, classified by officials, and eventually released for anyone willing to read them. The red tape is real. The witness statements are real. The confusion of the people who investigated them is real. If this kind of deep dive into declassified government records is your thing, if you believe that these stories deserve to be heard, studied, and taken seriously, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a like on this video. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. We've got a lot more files to go through. and they only get stranger from here. In our next video, we're going back to the very beginning, to the summer when America first discovered that something was flying in its skies that no one could identify. The year was 1947. The place was a remote airfield in the California desert, and what happened there